Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you're joining us today for this special conference on climate, conflict, and demography in Africa. This is a special conference at an opportune time, which has been organized to mark and celebrate the anniversaries of the International Crisis Group, the 60th anniversary of Africa Confidential, and the 120th anniversary of the Royal African Society. Now, this is a conference which has gathered an array of wonderful and impressive speakers and participants, all gathered with the aim of putting Africa's objectives on the agenda of COP26. How can our continent be adequately and fairly represented in Glasgow in November? This climate summit is said to be the most important of conferences since the Paris summit of 2015. But a coalition of 1,500 green organizations have already called for the postponement of this. Why? Well, they say they don't have enough vaccines in order to make their delegates safe in order to attend this conference, yet it's still going ahead. So this is just something to highlight the kind of inequalities that exist, not just when we're talking about COVID vaccines, but also when we're talking about the inequalities in the environment, the inequalities around climate change, and how all of you gathered, all of us gathered today may be able to combat this. So we have an array of wonderful speakers and delegates who are going to be participating today. And for these stakeholders, it is this major question: how will you ensure that decisions taken in November in Glasgow will have the continent's best interests at heart? The future of our world is at stake, there's no doubt about that. But in planning to save the planet and limit climate change, how do we ensure developing nations, the rich developing nations, aren't paying a higher price? How do we ensure that those richer industrialized nations don't penalize us once more? We're already suffering, bearing the brunt of climate change, even though we are the least polluters of this world. So this is just the context in which we are gathered today, and we'll be hearing a series of speakers who will be putting this on the agenda and thrashing out the major issues. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce, to speak to us, Aruma Ote, who was recently elected the chair of the Royal African Society. And she has a remarkable career in international finance, including spells as vice president of the African Development Bank, treasurer of the World Bank, and director general of Nigeria's Securities and Exchange Commission. And she's now based in Oxford as an executive in residence at the Said Business School and a scholar at St. Anthony's College, and is also a member of the London Stock Exchange Africa Advisory Group. A glittering career, but even more to share with us in terms of the experience. Thank you very much, and the floor is yours, Madam Ote. I believe you may be on mute, Madam.
Thank you, Ms. Masoro. Your Excellency, Vice President Osibajo, Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege and honor to make these opening remarks at the Royal Africa Society's 120th anniversary conference, particularly, as Bola, you said, on such an important theme of climate, security, and demography in Africa. I'm really proud of the program that has been put together and thank our partners, the International Crisis Group and the Africa Confidential, as well as our sponsors, the Open Society Foundation's 91, SOAS, and of course, my Royal African Society colleagues. In the 5 weeks that I have joined the Royal African Society, you have demonstrated that you are a dream team. My sincere appreciation to our speakers for making out time from what I know is a busy schedule to share your expertise and invaluable insights today. My gratitude, of course, goes to each participant on the various platforms, whether it's Hopins, Facebook Live, Twitter, YouTube, who are attending what I consider a flagship conference on climate. I've been struck particularly by the impressive turnout that we've seen from the registrations. I'm also happy that my first event as chairperson since I was elected on the 23rd of July is on this important theme. It is timely as we prepare for COP26 in 6 weeks, Bola, as you mentioned, but also as we start to think about COP27, which will be hosted in Africa next year. Climate change, as we all know, is existential. Indeed, 50% of Africa's GDP, today about $1.9 billion, is susceptible to negative effects of climate change. Yet Africa has only emitted 2% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. My view is that Africa must take a front row seat in defining and implementing both the Africa and the global climate agenda. Second, understanding the intersection of climate, security, and demography is crucial to Africa's social, political, and economic progress. Therefore, while determining how everyone achieves net zero targets by 2050, while that is key, Africa has a number of things to focus on. One of them that is so critical, which is why this conference is so important, is the heightened security risks that have been made worse and more complex by climate challenges. As the most youthful continent in the world, not harnessing Africa's demographic dividend will surely exacerbate both the climate and the security crisis. On the other hand, climate change represents enormous opportunity for Africa. Africa is energy poor. However, Africa is uniquely positioned to benefit from all of the clean energy options, whether hydro, geothermal, solar, and wind. We have a dearth of infrastructure, but it's also an opportunity to build smart infrastructure that responds to the current climate patterns. Harnessing Africa's youthful population, in my view, could unleash innovation that will enable Africa to take advantage of what people say is a $26 trillion new climate economy that could create 65 million jobs, which Africa needs so much. Africa needs to be driving the debate about the global climate, energy, and sustainability agenda. The promise that was first made in 2009 to provide $100 billion to developing countries who are most vulnerable to climate issues needs to be kept. As you all may be aware, Mary Kingsley, in whose memory the Royal African Society was founded 120 years ago, said that she traveled and explored Africa not to preach or rule as others did, but to listen and promote Africa's voice. Since our society's founding, we have sought to listen to Africa's voice and to amplify that voice. This is such a crucial time for Africa and society. I hope that at the end of this conference, that we will have greater clarity on the impact of climate change on Africa, as well as start to help Africa develop a roadmap to tackle these challenges. I hope that we will amplify Africa's voice on the topics of this conference, and of course, ensure that Africa's perspectives are taken account of. It will take a lot of hard work, so let us consider what we achieve here together, the beginning of an important journey to tackle climate, security, and demography in Africa with a collective sense of urgency. If not us, who are participants, who are speakers, who are organizers, who will it be? that will make sure that Africa is taken account of. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Arumaote, chairperson of the Royal African Society. And as she mentioned, we have no less than the Vice President of Nigeria, who will be joining us to give a keynote address and to answer some pressing questions that many of you may have regarding the continent and what our leaders are going to table at COP26 in November and the pressures that they face. But before then, we have a few more speakers. Patrick Smith, who is editor of Africa Confidential, is also joining us now to share a few words. And many of you, if you want the download on any country on the continent, Africa Confidential is a source of reference that very few will doubt the facts within the pages. Founded in 1960, Africa Confidential has a long-standing reputation for original reporting and analysis of key political and security developments across the continent. And Patrick Smith has been editor since 1991 and is one of the most experienced and respected journalists covering the continent. And he joins us now. Patrick, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Bola, for kind words. Well, first of all, welcome everybody. The conference has sold out twice, but you can follow it, as Aruma said, on all the other platforms, YouTube and Facebook and so on, if you couldn't get onto the registration. I think the timing of this conference is absolutely critical. We've got less than 6 weeks before the start of these COP26 talks. And for those of you like me a little longer in the tooth, you might remember this process started in 1990s in Rio when there was a mass Earth summit. And I think in our preparation for this conference, one of the things that has come up is that people are less and less exercised about what they can do about these issues in practical terms than they were back in those days. They were aware of the science in those days, almost 30 years ago, but they were casting around for the solutions. What we seem to have now is so many other issues are clouding in and making it harder to address these issues. So I think with the help of our expert panels, we've got a team of economists, macroeconomists, specialist economists, scientists, demographers. We've got a team of political scientists, practicing politicians as well. And then the panel I'm involved in is about getting the arguments across, getting the voices across. I think we're really equipped to take this on. In the run-up to COP26, one of the catchwords we get from the UN system and right across from all the big participating governments is this issue of ambition. And I think we have to be really ambitious in this conference. We have to make sure that this and along with other events really gets the concerns of the African continent on the agenda in a way that it may not have been represented in the official agenda for the COP talks. And that is not just the big scientific issues, but it's about the resource issues, and it's also about the community issues, how this is affecting people and relevant to people at the grassroots. And I think with the panels you're going to see this afternoon, we've really got the team that is able to take that on board. So thanks for signing up. Thanks for coming. And I'll leave you to our star-studded speakers. And back to Bola.
Thank you very much indeed, Patrick Smith. And Patrick, as he said, will be joining later, steering some of the very high-level panels. Now taking the stage is Professor Adam Habib, Director of the School of Oriental and African Studies, or SOAS, at the University of London. And Professor Habib is the former Vice-Chancellor of Witwatersrand University, or WITS, in South Africa. And he's a distinguished academic record as a political scientist, activist, and administrator. And he's one of the co-founders of the African Research Universities Alliance, which is an affiliation of research-intensive universities on the continent. He's published numerous numerous books and articles over the past 30 years, particularly on democratization and its consolidation in South Africa, but clearly, definitely not just, to stay saved to his own nation. It's also to do with democratization on the whole continent, and also what restricts and challenges the development of the continent. Professor Habib, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Paula, for that very, very generous introduction. I do want to, like Madame Arun Maote kicked off, is to welcome all of the participants to this this conference on climate change, demography, and conflict, in honor of the Royal African Society's 120th year. SOAS has been a partner for a very long time of the Royal African Society, and of course, the International Crisis Group, Africa Confidential, and many of the other institutional partners. We are incredibly excited at this conference for two reasons. Beyond the mandate, I must say, that Africa is one of the major focus areas of this school of the University of London. What it is, it seems to me, is twofold. I think it was Madame Arun Maote who started by saying, if COP26 is going to be successful, then Africa has to take front stage. The real challenge about that is, how does Africa take front stage in an unequal world? Because the differential of resources are so much against us, how can we take front stage? And it seems to me that the answer to that lies by us coming together as Africans. If we can come together as a collective continent to raise our collective voice about the global challenge of our time, then we begin to start creating the possibility for us to lead this conversation in the ways that it needs to be led. And there are two fundamental principles, it seems to me, that this conference speaks to that we quite keen on. The one is the principle of multidisciplinarity. You can't understand the implications of climate change if you don't understand its consequence for demography, its consequence for conflict. And if what you've got effectively is an intersectionality of challenges on this continent that feed off each other. And it seems to me that solutions have to be constructed through an intersectionality itself. We need to think through a comprehensive solution that is transdiscipline, if you like, multidiscipline. And how do we bring the politics, the economics, the technology, all in conversation with each other to achieve a particular outcome? And this conference recognizes that by the kind of thematic areas and the kinds of speakers it has. The second important issue that we need to reflect on, and this conference program brings to the fore, is that all of our challenges are transnational in character. Whether it's climate change, whether it's demography and conflict, whether it's inequality or this pandemic. And if we're going to resolve these challenges, we need to bring global solutions to these issues. And if you're going to bring global solutions, we need to make sure that the context in which 3/4 of humanity is living, the people of Africa, the people of Asia, the people of Latin America, the people of Middle East, their voices, their perspectives are brought to the fore. And in that context, if we're going to do that, if their perspectives are going to come to the fore, we need to ensure that there are human capabilities there. And we need to ensure that there are institutional capacities there to allow that to happen. Which means that we need to reimagine higher education. We can't think of solutions being fashioned in Bloomsbury in London by SOAS. But we can imagine SOAS partnering institutions and universities on the continent to co-configure training, to co-configure teaching, to co-configure research, and to co-configure solutions that are global solutions for the collective of humanity. And that's what effectively this conference is about. SOAS is involved in this conference, but we're involved in other kinds of initiatives with Standard Bank on bringing together negotiating teams from across Africa so that we can create like-minded positions as we enter into COP26. And what I want you to remember as we speak is not finding only the thematic solutions, but I want all of us to start becoming advocates for demanding vice chancellors or directors like myself start taking seriously building institutional capacity on the African continent to address those challenges. So I want to say welcome to this event, and I want to say let us have honest, frank, and robust conversation in the hours ahead. Thank you, Bola.
Professor Habib, thank you so much for that very passionate address. And you've certainly given us all a lot of food for thought and a very nice foundation, both from you, Madame Otte, and also Patrick Smith, a wonderful foundation for our keynote speaker, for His Excellency, the Vice President of Nigeria, Professor Yemi Osinbajo, who joins us now. Welcome to you, sir. And before I hand the floor to you, sir, if I may just give some of our listeners who are perhaps in need of an introduction to you and also your role and your activism in terms of environment and climate change. Nigeria's Vice President was a former Attorney General of Lagos State and Commissioner for Justice. He's also a senior advocate of Nigeria, or SAN, and was a professor of law and a senior partner with Simmons Cooper Partners, a commercial law practice firm, before his inauguration as Vice President. But during nearly 40 years of litigation experience, Vice President Osinbajo presided over disputes regarding ownership and control of oil and gas resources and energy disputes, including multinationals who are involved in power projects in Nigeria. And he recently argued in Foreign Affairs that energy use and emissions are so low in Africa that even tripling electricity consumption through natural gas would add just 0.6% to global emissions. Yet against that backdrop, we hear the West, developing countries, telling we as Africans to cease using or reduce the use of fossil fuels. So how, sir, do we find that balance? How do we get our voices heard, as we heard Madame Otte say, and how do we put it on the stage? Vice President, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, His Excellency, for joining us.
Thank you very much, Bola. The chair of the Royal African Society, Ms. Aruma Otte, co-hosts Africa Confidential and the International Crisis Group. Thank you for this opportunity to very quickly share a few thoughts on the issues of climate change, conflict, and demography. There is a global consensus that extreme weather and disruptions from drought, flooding, and conflicts over natural resources disproportionately affect the developing world, particularly the most vulnerable in our communities, including women and children. Air pollution kills more Africans than even childhood malnutrition or contaminated water. Data from WHO shows that annually, there are about 2.2 million environment-related deaths on the continent. Further, when we discuss climate conflict and demography, the issue of adaptation and resilience cannot be overlooked. West African coastal areas, for example, have long provided livelihood for millions of fishermen. The coastal ecosystems used to provide a range of essential services, including fishery resources, which have now been severely hit, especially on account of rising sea levels, triggering floods, erosion, increased salinity, and disappearance of certain species of fish. Beyond causing major losses in coastal infrastructure, this also exposes many human settlements to the risk of inundation, which results in interregional migration. Of course, this results in loss of lives and livelihoods, and often accompanied by community and regional conflicts. Agriculture, as everyone knows, is the backbone of Africa's economy and accounts for the majority of livelihoods across the continent. But our exposure and vulnerability to climate change impacts this also. And so these impacts are not limited to certain regions or people, but to our economy as a whole, from the macroeconomic impact of rising food prices to health and well-being impacts resulting from heat stress. So it's obvious that the global climate, energy, and development conversation can no longer happen on separate tracks. But despite these huge setbacks that I've mentioned, and despite being negligible contributors to CO2 emissions, we in Africa continue to be the most adversely impacted by climate change. So much so that public resources that could help modernize our energy mix has to be redirected towards adaptation spending. But worse, we are being compelled to make disproportionately huge sacrifices as the wealthier countries continue full speed on defunding gas projects and insisting that gas projects must be defunded as an important component of the drive towards net zero emissions by 2030. So our first obligation for us and for African countries must always be to ensure the well-being of our people through access to development services, including electricity, healthcare, education, safe jobs, and a safe environment, including access to clean cooking fuels. We must prioritize solutions that align the development and climate agendas. And that is absolutely important. We must align the development and climate agendas. The global climate conversation can only be equitable and inclusive by putting all people in all geographies at the heart of the endeavor to save the planet. We must recognize and plan for growing energy demand. Its increase will be critical for driving growth, jobs, and economy-wide progress, and delivering healthcare and education services. Efforts are already underway, for example, in my country, Nigeria, and in several countries across the continent, to transition to large shares of clean energy sources to do this. To get the world on track for net zero emissions by 2050, the amount of investments required in clean electricity, generation and grid storage infrastructure will need to rise to more than 1.6 trillion US dollars per year by 2030 at least. This is over 4 times more than what was invested in these sectors in 2020. In regions like Africa, installed electricity capacity will need to double from by 2030 and increase at least 5-fold by 2050. So much of the global investment in clean electricity will need to go into Africa. However, instead of prioritizing efforts to redirect global capital to our nations, efforts are underway to limit the development of gas projects in Africa, violating the principles of equity and justice enshrined in global agreements. Further, it also poses a grave threat to Africa's energy transition because the role of gas, for example, as a bridge fuel to increase the share of renewable energy in the energy mix and to rapidly transition away from firewood-based cooking fuel to natural gas-based cooking yields. Obviously, to natural gas-based cooking, obviously yields both environmental and health benefits. But LPG-based policies, liquefied gas-based policies, and schemes are critical to realizing the required annual global investment in gas for cooking to increase rather than be constrained. The global community must recognize that all fossil fuels are not the same, and the critical role of bridge fuels in advancing the energy transition and addressing energy poverty is absolutely crucial. Making capital available to fulfill the growing demand, the growing energy demand in these regions of the world is central to reaching the goals of the Paris Agreement. So the energy access element of the energy transition and the adaptation and resilience element of climate change must all be interlinked and given equal importance. If energy access issues are left unaddressed, we'll continue to see growing energy demand being addressed with high polluting and deforesting fuels, such as diesel, kerosene, and firewood. As a result, efforts aimed to advance climate goals must first and foremost create carbon space for growing economies that have historically made negligible contributions to global emissions and have an obligation to their people to provide access to energy for electricity, for cooking, and productive uses. I think I'll just stop here. I'm sure I've exceeded the 5 minutes I've been given, and to just again say a very happy birthday to the Africa Society, happy 120th birthday, and many, many more years of great impact. Thank you very much.
Your Excellency, thank you very much indeed. But there are, of course, still so many questions that people have and that I would like to put to you on behalf of those who are participating and watching. I think because many people wonder what is going to happen when you and others in the African negotiating team arrive in Glasgow, and how an impact our contribution will make, and whether they're actually listening. You talked about the inequalities and the lack of equity and justice. So what is a just energy transition from our continent's perspective?
Well, I think clearly a just transition would involve taking into account access to energy for African countries. And really creating, as I've said, carbon space for us. There is no way that we can have a just transition without taking into account the fact that we require transition fuels, such as gas, for example, to be able to make that transition effectively and cost effectively for many African countries. What we're seeing at the moment, is a rush towards defunding gas projects, which obviously means that we're not going to be able to use this transition fuel, or at least be able to use it at any kind of cost that will make sense, which of course means that access to energy for us, for many developing countries and many African countries, will be well nigh impossible in some cases. So I think that a just transition obviously must take into account all of the requirements of access to energy for us, and also the promises that have been made over time. $100 billion was the promises in previous COP, in several of the other climate change conferences, and these have simply not showed up. We simply have not found the funding that is required for these transitions. And as I've said, just for energy access issues alone, our needs are certainly greater than many of the developed countries, and those needs should be addressed. So those are the components, I think, of a fair and just transition.
If I can pick you up on that, because I do want to ask about the fossil fuels in quite depth, especially because you spoke about this during the Foreign Affairs article that you wrote. But picking up on the 100 billion, because we know the developed world is falling behind, falling short on the promises they made in terms of that 100 billion. And yet as COP26, I understand African negotiators are now putting 20 to 30 billion, or pushing for that and putting that on the table. If they couldn't even give the 100 billion and they've reneged on that promise, why are you as African leaders even putting any faith that they would give even more in order for the African continent and developing nations to mitigate the effects of climate change?
Well, I mean, hope is never lost, and we strongly believe that these obligations will be met. In any event, they have to be met if the transition goals are to be met. So I think that we remain very hopeful, and we must continue to put our case clearly, because really, I mean, everyone knows that in order to be able to effectively transit in the way that we've all agreed, and even to comply with the various international agreements. This is this is fundamental. So I don't think that not putting our case clearly, merely because there have been defaults in the past, is the way to go. I strongly believe that we should say exactly what it is that is required, and hope that our partners would do the honorable thing.
And I like the fact that you use the word partners, something that I think the previous speakers also spoke about, that this should be a joint collaboration rather than somebody dictating or others dictating to us, as has been the case up until now. But how do you achieve that partnership? How do you achieve that cooperation when, for instance, as you wrote in Foreign Affairs, we are being told to stop using fossil fuels, yet our emissions are so low in Africa? How do you convince industrialized nations that we can and should use them while also protecting the environment, when you're also up against, this kind of mantra that we hear from countries in the West?
I think some of the arguments, merely require being restated clearly, because they are pretty intuitive, and I think that because everyone is committed to zero emissions in the ways that have been agreed, I would say that any reasonable argument that makes this more likely to happen within the timeframes that have been prescribed will be accepted by all. So for example, the argument that we need fossil fuels, especially gas, to transit to renewable energies eventually, and to transit to zero emissions. It's a very clear and logical one. And one of the major reasons is that you need gas, for example, to ensure that we are able to contain deforestation. Firewood is, of course, used broadly in several, African countries, especially in the rural areas. LPG is the answer to that, and of course it's cleaner. It's much cleaner. So if we want to avoid deforestation, that's obviously the way to go. And so I think that some of these arguments are compelling, and I have, I'm strongly of the view that when we present these arguments as clearly and show what the actual benefits are to the overall objective of net zero emissions, we should be able to persuade our partners. I'm not, and I think that already we are getting some traction on some of the issues that we're raising, and I believe that we will achieve the clear objective of being able to make the case that a just and fair transition can only mean that will enable the use of clean fossil fuels such as gas, at least during that transition period and for as long as is necessary.
I won't keep you for too long, Professor Adebayo, but I do have a question that I know will play on the minds of many Nigerians who may be listening, and across the West African sub-region, and that's that, if I come closer to home, many people are seeing the direct links of climate change on their doorsteps. If we're looking at the 36 states in Nigeria, for instance, and I'm talking about climate change and conflict, when we're looking at herder and farmer conflicts and clashes that are spreading at such a rate, it's untrue. When we talk about how many people, tens of thousands have been killed, hundreds of thousands displaced. What can you tell us about this link? But also many people would be wondering what you as a government and other African leaders are doing in order to try and stem that.
Yes. Well, first, all of these are related, which obviously is why the topic is, or the theme of this conference is, as it was laid out. Every one of these issues is related. Climate change, of course, is related to the questions around energy use and all that. And that's why we are making the arguments that we're making, that we must be able to control deforestation, for example. And one of the ways of controlling deforestation is, just as I've mentioned, we need to be able to use more gas. We need to ensure that more people have access to energy. How do we ensure that more people have access to energy? I mean, before we get to before we are able to use renewable energy in much greater form than we're using it at the moment, we certainly need to be able to deal with the questions around use of gas. But also, if you look at some of the work that's going on and some of the collaboration that's going on across West Africa, for instance, on the Great Green Wall projects, where there's a tree planting efforts are going on to be able to arrest to some extent the deforestation. And then some of the big plans around the livestock transformation plans, which would encourage more sedentary livestock farming, and all of those ideas. Now, these are huge problems that have bedeviled many of our countries, especially the Sahel region, for years and years and years. But the problem cannot be solved overnight. But I think that some of what we're trying to do, some of these various components, once they come together, we'll be able to see a sea change. We'll be able to see a substantial change in the circumstances.
One of the things that you've mentioned and clearly is a major problem for the continent is the lack of money, despite the pledges that have been made by industrialized nations. But it's not just a case of the climate finance, is it? It's also the political will. Are you convinced that your counterparts in the West, in industrialized nations, do have the political will? I ask that because when we're looking at COVID, and there are direct parallels that many are drawing, we see this inequality growing. I mean, the fact that you have so many thousands of grassroots organizations saying, well, maybe we should actually stop the COP26 because we can't get there, speaks of that major inequality. So what about in terms of the environment, in terms of climate change? Are you convinced they are listening because they have the political will to listen and to create this fairer, just society?
I think the truth is that every country, and most countries of the world anyway, would look to their interests first. But I think it's also becoming obvious that that simply isn't the way the world works, and it certainly isn't even feasible. So whether as a matter of self-interest or for more altruistic reasons, you begin to look at how others, especially those in the less developed world, will survive, how they will do well, and taking them into account in the big plans and all of that. Whether it's for self-interest or for altruistic reasons, there's no question in my mind that must be the way to go, and that the arguments are compelling for our partners in the wealthier countries to see that there's absolutely no way out. I mean, just to the point that you made about COVID-19 and vaccine nationalism and all of that, I think it's becoming obvious to the world that you cannot have vaccine nationalism and expect the world to be a safe place. I mean, no one is safe if half of the world still runs the risk of high infection rates of COVID or any other disease. No one is safe. I think that these are arguments that compel everyone. And we've seen even from COVID-19 vaccines and some of the more, if you like, some more collaboration that's taking place today. I think there's a lot more collaboration. There's a lot more emphasis on trying to work together, get more vaccines across to developing countries who may not be able to afford it. I think there's a greater move in that respect. And I can see that will be the case as we go along. And this is the same with climate change. You may start off, and some of our partners start off thinking of themselves and thinking of their countries and their regions. But it is up to us, and this is the point that we've been making for the past couple of months and years, that is up to us to make the case, a compelling case, which I believe we're making, that you simply cannot expect any real great results if you leave such a significant part of the world out of your considerations. So I'm hopeful. I'm very optimistic that our partners in the wealthier countries will see the point.
Professor Yemi Osinbajo, Your Excellency, Vice President of Nigeria, thank you so much for giving us of your time and for joining us today for this special conference.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. And from Nigeria's Vice President, and we're very grateful that he gave us so much of his time, we move now to Ghana. Unfortunately, President Nana Akufo-Addo of Ghana will not be able to join the conference today, and he has given his apologies. But as many of you can imagine, as current chair of the Economic Community of West African States, that is, of course, ECOWAS, there are equally pressing matters, including the ongoing situation in Guinea, and it means he can't attend. But representing the president is the man who knows all too well the ravages of climate change that it's having not just on his own country, but also around the continent. Dr. Kweku Afriye is Ghana's Minister for Environment, Science, Technology and Innovation. He's a medical doctor and a farmer. And like the humble subsistence farmers in his own land, he knows how disastrous not being able to predict the rains, for example, to coping with drought, or how do you find water for irrigation. He knows how disastrous that can be. Dr. Afriye has also, with his department, also been challenged by finding ways to limit e-waste exports and the environmental health dangers these bring. These have just been some of the impacts of climate change. And Dr. Afriye, thank you very much for joining us. And I hand the mic to you, sir.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon from Accra, Ghana, on a cloudy and a very rainy day. And I'm glad to speak on behalf of the President of the Republic. And by the way, let me thank Professor Osinbajo, the Vice President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. I've learned a lot of things from him. And Excellencies, distinguished participants. So I've been mandated by the President to speak on his behalf on this very important subject of climate, conflict, and demography in Africa. The President would have loved, like you said, to be here, but because of these pressing issues, he's asked me to speak on his behalf. As we all know, the onslaught of COVID-19 tells volumes of the disproportionate vulnerabilities of humanity. It also mirrors the glimpse of a far worse global pandemic that awaits us, or as the latest IPCC report, activate code red for humanity. Across Africa, the daily struggles of many families, especially in rural areas, who are as a result of systemic poverty and inequalities, but also due to the devastating consequences of long drought, frequent and intense floods, and the onset of sea level rising. Excellencies, participants, the science of climate change is unequivocal and uncontested. The manifestations are telling in all our daily lives. It's also seen as a chief instigator of migration and displacement of people. As Ghana is no exception, we are co-host to several migrants from the West African sub-region and even beyond. The harsh and deteriorating climate conditions in northern Ghana undoubtedly energize the region growing food insecurity and the seasonal north to south migration. And besides the increasing occurrence of floods and protracted droughts, leads to the displacement of people. Statistics show that over the last few years, there's been a new internal displacement which has occurred in Ghana due to climate-induced disasters and even beyond our borders. Excellencies, It is well known that Africa contributes less than 4% of global greenhouse emissions to climate change, and yet Africa bears the greatest brunt of its effects. Africa is also likely to suffer greatly from the socio-economic consequences of policies of other countries as the world is poised to vigorously pursue green transition in the next 3 decades. This phenomenon is already showing up in recent studies on stranded resources and their implications for the oil and gas industry in particular, especially in West Africa. And Ghana faces the prospects of this phenomenon of stranded resources, especially in the oil and gas industry. Although Africa contributes little to climate change, like we said, but we suffer the most from it. And the continent is also paradoxically being asked to do more than it is already doing. Amid the strain on public finances, Africa invests in climate change measures to protect its people. But the same urgency is not what we see from the international community. We call for concrete action to beat climate change more than lip service. We need the same collective strength we are fighting the COVID-19 pandemic with to combat climate temperature rises as a result of the climate change. And indeed, if we may go backwards, the world has done this before. The way we all united to fight smallpox, for example, the way we united to eradicate polio and so on, so especially in the health sector, we can certainly unite to beat climate change. But Africa deserves to have a lot of investment to do this. Ladies and gentlemen, Africa finds itself on the crossroads to continue to justly develop its resources to better the well-being of its people, and at the same time effectively participate in the global effort to address global climate change. Ghana will continue to canvass for one African voice in this COP26 in Glasgow, as the international community needs to conclude a rule book for implementing the Paris Agreement. Africa needs to continue the advocacy in the COP26 to ask for equal attention on issues such as access to climate finance and adaptation, as it is the surest way to safeguard the economic prosperity of the African peoples. And I thank you very much and wish you best in your deliberations. Thank you very much.
Honorable Dr. Kweku Afriyie, Environment Minister of Ghana, thank you very, very much for sharing the words of President Akufo-Addo. And if I may put one question to you, it's just one of the many that we have from the floor, but there are many people who are wondering various issues coming from this, and something that I know will be of interest to you is from somebody called Michael Lomote, who says, what alternative economic models, if any, are being considered for climate-threatened Africa, and how much will climate debt and reparations underpin these alternative models?
Well, there are several alternate models, and we believe that energy underpins everything. So if I may speak for Ghana, the development is directly related to the way we are able to marshal our forces to address the question of energy deficit, and energy poverty. So we are into several scenarios. For example, the Vice President of Nigeria talked about gas as a transition resource where we get even the more cleaner energy sources. That is something that we have to push and consider. Ghana, for example, is looking at let me put it this way: a circular economy might seem a very sophisticated way of doing things in Africa to some, but we believe that its time has even come, because we have the opportunity to think of it and to align ourselves to that idea and do all the things that can make us transition into that. So, for example, we are working very fast on this plastic waste, in which is fairly also related to this climate issue. So there are several options that are under consideration. We have not picked just because we believe that we are still in the conversation mode, even though we have signed on to several issues. But when the push comes to show, for example, Ghana may have to look in the energy mix, the question of nuclear energy, for example. Historically, Ghana has been at the forefront the use of nuclear energy, and we are. I believe that we are very far advanced in that stage is where we can, because our resources, for example, the bauxite industry in Ghana, we believe that it is something that we can leverage to advance the economy of this country. So yes, we have got several options that we have to consider. Some of them we have moved on very, far advanced, and we'll be taking decisions on them. Others are still in the mix, and we will consider them as the world evolves.
Dr. Kweku Afriye, Minister of Environment, Science, Technology and Innovation. Thank you very, very much, sir, for joining us from Ghana, and also for representing not just your ministry, but also the President himself, President Akufo-Addo. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, sir.
Thanks, and my apology on behalf of the President yet again. Thanks.
Thank you very much, sir. And we move from the minister in Ghana to our first session, which is on climate and democracy, managing economic pressures. And we've been hearing from all the key speakers, no less from the Vice President and also from the Ghanaian Minister of Environment, about the economic pressures of climate change on the continent. And who better now to give a keynote speech on this issue than Dr. Donald Kaberuka, who was the president of the African Development Bank for 10 years until 2015, transforming it into a widely respected international financial institution. Since then, he's fulfilled a wide range of public and private sector roles and is currently the High Representative of the African Union's Peace Fund and an envoy for COVID financing. Dr. Kaberuka, thank you very, very much. And I humbly hand over to you, sir.
Thank you, Bola. Thank you, colleagues. Good morning, good afternoon. I want to begin by thanking the organizers, the Royal African Society. Thanks, Aruma. Thanks, Nicholas, and the crisis group, Comfort, Aero, and Patrick at Africa Confidential for getting us together ahead of Glasgow COP, and wish you happy returns. This get together is really timely because it is critical that we get Africa's priorities, especially the COVID implications, which has exposed our health systems, safety nets, economic resilience on the agenda at Glasgow. So thank you very much for doing so. I think Vice President Osinbajo has spelled out the issues very well. And in the coming sessions, my colleagues will be talking about security, voice and advocacy, and implications for Glasgow. So that is exactly the right thing to do. My assignment and that of our distinguished panelists is to look at the population dynamics and economic challenges which that brings. Now, let me begin by saying that we have always known that in the next 20, 30 years, there are three mega trends which will impact significantly the African economies. The first, the demographics. Demographics is the numbers in the structure, internal migration, displacement, and of course, urbanization. I happen at the moment to co-chair an international panel on displacement around the world with Federica Mogherini, former EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs. And the reason is simple, that for the first time in the last 50 years, the number of internally displaced persons is at record high. over 60 million people, depending upon how you count them. And that is either because of conflict, or because of climate, or because of a combination of the two. And in spite of that, this issue of internally displaced persons has not been on the radar of the international community. And when it appears, which is quite rare, it is subsumed under refugees, which is not the same, and also appears as more a humanitarian issue rather than a long-term development problem, as Secretary General of the UN, Guterres, puts it very well. The second mega trend, which will impact Africa in the next 20 years, beyond these demographic dynamics, is technology. The manner in which technology from simple to complex will impact the development path of our continent. And then, of course, climate change. Now, we all know the numbers. In 1950, in sub-Saharan Africa, the population was just about 180 million people. 180 million people. We're now past a billion people. Population grows at 2.7% per annum. 2.7% per annum. Compare that with Asia, which is about 1.2%, or Latin America, which is 0.9%. And within these numbers, there are huge variations from Botswana, which is 1%, to Niger, which is 3%. To put it crudely, it's as if sub-Saharan Africa population adds up the equivalent of the UK every single year. Every single year. And as we know very well, by 2050, with a global population of 9.7 billion or thereabout, Africa will be probably just under half of the number. Now, those trends in fertility, mortality, and the impact on poverty will, of course, evolve over the next 30 years, but they'll evolve in a manner which requires that we bring them to the fore as we are doing right now. So, will it be a windfall, or which some people call a dividend, or will it be its opposite? Will it spur economic growth under the right conditions? The right conditions is in education investment, health investment, in governance, and how to manage security challenges. Or would it be a wasted opportunity? Many colleagues here have spoken this morning about the opportunities brought about those dynamics, as in energy investments, infrastructure, and all the urban-driven demands. Now, my colleagues will be speaking about security and climate later in the panel. Competition for natural resources has been there since historical times, for land, for water, or forestry as population increases. The issue is how we manage it. In fact, a UN report, I think 7 years ago, called climate change the ultimate threat multiplier. The ultimate threat multiplier. So as population increases, recurring droughts and floods, desertification, shrinking water resources and water bodies, diminishing forests, energy resources, of course, competition for those resources can only have political, social, and economic consequences. But I think, as Patrick Smith mentioned at the beginning, we have known these issues since 1992 at the Rio Conference. And the principles were announced of what the world can do. But why are we here since Rio? And for probably elements of an answer, let me try to fast forward. In the last 10 years, the world has known 3 truly existential crises. The current crisis, the pandemic of COVID, 10 years ago or thereabouts, the financial crisis, and much less spoken of a year before the financial crisis, the food crisis. But this is not well spoken about because, like Ebola, it was more a problem of poor countries. unlike the current pandemic or the financial crisis, which is seen as a threat to global security. And it's not surprising that the response to Ebola or the food crisis was probably not at the magnitude required, and it has shown in the current crisis in the manner in which we're very poorly prepared. So in the limited amount of time I've been given, since we know the issues from Rio, from the previous COPs, where do you go from here to try and manage this from an economic perspective? I think the first thing, as this conference is trying to do, is to get the adaptation agenda at Glasgow with a strong African content. And I'm talking about an adaptation agenda, not from probably a reactive Western lens, but from a proactive African lens, whether it is agriculture, water and forest resources, health and education, or the energy transition, which Vice President Osinbajo has spoken about very eloquently, with the opportunities which all that begins. Reducing our dependence on natural capital and ensuring that it is now very, very clear that building resilience of our economies will have to be increasingly dependent on an inclusive economy which seeks to exploit our natural resources in a sustainable way more than we have done before. Now, I think building the low carbon economy that is so efficient, that is socially inclusive, is something which all of us can agree upon. But can the international community truly respond to this challenge? I agree with our Vice President that we have to work together. The kind of nationalism, protectionism we have seen since a year ago will not do. It's a short-term solution for countries in the global north, but will not produce the solutions we need. We'll have to find a way of working together as we did during the global financial crisis, beginning with ensuring that vaccines are available to all in the world. There's no way the global economy will recover to its pre-COVID potential unless vaccination is available everywhere. As Kristalina Georgieva puts it very well, economic policy number one today is about making vaccines available for everyone. It can't just be that in some parts of the world, people will get to the third dose when in many countries, less than 1% of the population have access to vaccines. It's not a problem of science. It's not a problem of technology. It's not even a problem of financing. It's a problem of global solidarity, which is falling short, which is falling much shorter than it was during 2008. I think we'll have to rethink our safety nets. This COVID crisis has shown all of us, rich countries and poor countries, that our social safety nets are not where they should be. It has exacerbated inequalities, and as a result of that, our systems are less resilient than before. And let me end. I know, Bola, you are very strict on your time. Let me end by saying that for we in Africa, we have figured out of creating another resilience, bearing in mind that the global solidarity is falling short. Because the global solidarity is falling short, the solution is continental solidarity, beginning with building a strong intra-African free continental free trade area, while addressing issues of inequalities, resilience, and social safety nets in our countries. I would have loved to articulate a bit more on these issues, but the time is limited. But thank you, Bola, for giving me the time.
Dr. Daniel Donald Kaberuka, thank you very much indeed, sir, for enunciating those points very clearly for us. And without further ado, let me hand over to Franny Lothier, who's going to be moderating the next session. And Franny is currently a senior partner in the Southbridge Group and has worked as a development economist and vice president at the African Development Bank and the Trade Development Bank. Her vast experience on development issues in both public and private sectors makes her perfectly placed to chair this discussion. Franny, I hand over to you now.
Thank you very much, Paula, and it's a real pleasure to be following my boss in this panel. We are running quite late, so I'll be quite brief in my opening remarks. Welcome to this first session, where our panel is going to look at climate and demography, managing the economic pressures. We've already heard a lot from the previous speakers, including a very interesting expose from Dr. Kaberuka. So I'm going to proceed in introducing our excellent panel for this afternoon. We have with us Dr. Zainab Usman, who is Director of the Africa Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a position she got recently, so congratulations, Zainab, and welcome. We have Dr. Richard Chinkota, who is a well-known political demographer and has held many positions, but most recently a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Thank you for joining us from Washington, D.C. this morning. We have Dr. Albert Zufak, who is Chief Economist for Africa at the World Bank. Albert, welcome. And then we have Jean-Paul Adam, who has been a Minister of Finance, Foreign Affairs and Health, but today he is Director of Technology, Climate Change and Natural Resource Management at the UN Economic Commission for Africa in Addis. Our panelists are going to walk us through and dig a bit deeper in some of these questions that have been raised. And I'll just say 2-3 things quickly. From my perspective, I realize that with 95% of Africa's population still cooking using biofuels like charcoal and wood, deforestation is growing, and therefore transition fuels become critical, and natural gas has been mentioned as one. With gas infrastructure, you could jump into the 21st, 22nd century by using the same infrastructure for hydrogen. So that's a good possibility for Africa as well, to reuse the oil and gas technology for new fuels like hydrogen. We have a lot of transformation we can engage as well at the small and medium enterprise level and take advantage of these carbon reducing technologies like the one called Orca, which has just gone into production in Iceland this week, and some very innovative carbon technologies that have come out of Finland. But I'll stop here because we want to keep this session up to time and leave room for some questions and answers from the participants. So please post your questions in the Q&A box or the chat and we'll try to get to them. But let's first have some brief opening remarks, and I'm going to ask Zainab to walk us through. Zainab, you have 3 minutes to give your quick perspective. Zainab? Okay, I see that Albert is going first. So Albert, why don't you go ahead with your quick remarks?
Thank you very much, Franny, and Your Excellencies and guests. It's a pleasure and privilege to speak here today. I'm speaking from Yaoundé, Cameroon, where I'm on mission, and where it snowed for the first time in the west of the country forever. So, if we're still doubting on how climate is changing and affecting our economies, then we do have a proof here, playing off in front of us, right? And we are actually having a storm looming, a tropical storm looming in the Gulf of Guinea. So I'm mentioning this because climate change, although Africa is only responsible for less than 3% of global emission of carbon dioxide, our economies are deeply and disproportionately affected by climate change. And I'll probably want to leave you with 3 quick messages. And I know we are short on time, and see if we can elaborate a little bit more later. So the first message I have is we cannot divorce issues of economic growth in Africa with climate change consideration. We have to make sure we account for the impact of climate change and focus on adaptation in our strategies. So that's the first message, and this is because climate change is affecting our economies in all its aspects, and I can come back to that. The second message I have is that Africa needs jobs. That's priority number one, given the demographic pressure our countries are under. Our countries need jobs, and our climate transition strategies should be focusing on employment, should be focusing on how to leverage the change in our structure to create more jobs for our youth, our women, our younger populations. So focus on jobs, and that would include green jobs, but we also need to acknowledge that green jobs alone will not be enough. So that's my second message. And my third message is we should seize the climate change as a huge opportunity for green structural transformation. Africa has a number of assets, a number of natural capital that can actually be harnessed for a green transformation, in a way that hasn't happened before. We can actually leapfrog here as well. So these are my 3 messages. And if I may say a little bit more on how climate change is affecting our economies, I think it is clear that from the Sahel to the Horn of Africa and to the southern corner of Africa, the continent is experiencing devastating effects of more extreme weather patterns and slow onset changes. So the social and economic disruption of singular and recurrent climate shocks are wide-ranging and can multiply quickly with intergenerational consequences for our economies. So if you look into really quantifying those impact, we do have adverse weather shocks that include rising temperatures, extreme weather events that lower agricultural productivity and agricultural income. And we know agriculture is still the sector hiring or employing the majority of our populations in Africa. And because climate change is reducing productivity in agriculture, is also slowing down structural transformation of our economies. So, we need to make sure we bring together in our economic assessment the impact of climate change. And that's why I said earlier, we cannot divorce the two. And there is clear empirical evidence that there are long-term growth effects of persistent climate shocks. And that impact goes through physical capital, human capital, education, health, and mortality, for example.
Thank you, Albert. Thank you very much for your remarks. We will bring you back in for the Q&A because we do have a pressure for time. So
okay.
So much for your opening remarks. I'm going to bring in Zainab for a very quick opening remark. Zainab, you are next.
Excellent. Good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Excellent. I think the previous speakers, His Excellency the Vice President of Nigeria, Albert Sufak from the World Bank, and a couple of others have already mentioned a lot of things, so I don't want to go into too much detail. I think what I'm just going to say is that as everyone has said, African countries are already disproportionately impacted by the effects of climate change. But as we're seeing right now, there's an acceleration of momentum for global climate action. But within this context, proactive efforts have to be made to marry climate action policies, as we're seeing them now being announced, as we're seeing the pressure increasing with Africa's economic development needs. And I believe that there are challenges to achieving this objective, but there are also a lot of opportunities, and I want to try to kind of quickly outline some of them. And as we've already heard, there's an increased severity of climate events, extreme weather events also across most parts of Africa, the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, which is really disrupting livelihoods, particularly in agriculture, in which the incomes of 60 to 80% of Africans rely on. And the other important thing, which is an important contextual information here, is that we know that Africa has a very rapidly changing demographic structure, in the sense that the population itself is growing rapidly. It is said to exceed 2 billion people by the year 2050. It is a young continent with a median age of around 19 years, and it is also urbanizing rapidly. Currently, around 44% of the population is urban, and it also has the fastest rate of urbanization in the world. And very, very importantly, with this change in demographic structure of a young population, which is rapidly growing, which is very, very young, there's a need for jobs. There's a need for good quality jobs. But unfortunately, the vast majority of Africans are engaged in the informal sector, in agriculture, but also in trade. So there's a need to create jobs for young people in Africa within this context of climate change. But what then does it mean that we have this acceleration of momentum around climate action, especially with the re-entry of the United States into the Paris Agreement in January this year? That re-entry kind of led to more net zero pledges being made by governments around the world, by institutional investors such as pension funds, endowments, but also by the private sector, for which to whom we're seeing a lot of activist shareholder pressure to divest from fossil fuels. So there are, I think, a lot of opportunities here, but also significant challenges. And I think a lot of the challenges have already been identified. But I think there are also opportunities. So around natural resources, for example, in the sense that I think this is a great opportunity for African countries to put the objective of achieving economic diversification squarely back on the policy agenda. So what does that mean? It means prioritizing, private sector development. It means prioritizing regulatory reforms and things like that. So I'll just quickly round up with one point here that I think this is the time for global cooperation and global solidarity to rally the necessary resources for sustainable climate action in ways that marry these objectives of limiting carbon emissions with the development priorities of African countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zainab. I'm going to ask now Jean-Paul to come in and give his quick remarks because Jean-Paul, you come from the Seychelles and you have seen that this message is really not at the level where Africa ought to be in terms of the Afrobarometer results and others. So what can we do to get the message across, and what role do you see for technology?
Well, I think first and foremost, we need to recognize that the current model of development for Africa has not generated the inclusive level of development that we would have liked. We've tended to have a level of development which has been focused around the extraction of resources, minimal value addition, and with a link to export. That's not to be completely dismissive of those activities. We've managed to achieve quite a lot, but going forward, and particularly in the face of the pandemic and in the face of climate change, the model needs to shift towards more sustainable and inclusive value chains, which improve the opportunity for creation of value addition and therefore link more with the SME sector and provide more jobs for young people, linking therefore to the demographic opportunity. And if we can't do that, then of course there will be a demographic challenge. And what we're seeing in Africa is that the extractive model of resource transformation has also an impact on the environment. Africa, even though Africa has still got a very large amount of forest cover, it is the fastest, has the fastest loss of forest cover over the last decade of all regions in the world. And if that's not arrested, then that will create further impetus for climate impacts and reduce resilience. So in terms of technology, we need technologies that are going to be transformative in the immediate. We can't afford to say the technologies will bring something in the long term. We need to have technologies that will deliver results in the immediate in terms of livelihoods. And therefore, some of the first elements need to be some simple transformative technologies that can lead to immediate improvements in outcomes. So recent studies that the Economic Commission for Africa have done have shown that by investing particularly in green technologies, we can get a higher return on investment than if we remain focused on fossil fuel-based sectors. In some countries, we saw, and if we take the example of the Republic of South Africa, we saw a return of 420% more in terms of value addition by investing in green sectors, particularly in renewable energy, and looking at a shift, for example, towards electrification of vehicles, than if we were to remain focused on fossil fuel-based investments. And there are other very simple technologies that can be used in certain countries. If we look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, simply investing in irrigation in agriculture can lead to a 490% return on investment in relation to the returns that can be achieved. So sometimes these simple technological solutions can help us reduce the risk of climate change in terms of livelihoods, and therefore reduce displacements, reduce the challenges and also the conflicts around resources, because ultimately it's about livelihoods. And then the final point I'll make is that emerging technologies can also be deployed to better identify risks before they happen. So using technologies, for example, in climate resilience and in many cases even meteorological services can be better monetized in Africa to actually generate incomes for the populations that both use those services, but also can use those by hosting, for example, the equipment that can deliver climate information services. They can actually monetize this and actually sell this data and information to other service providers as part of building their livelihoods, while also having a resource that helps them build resilience for themselves. So these are just a few examples, but ultimately it's about looking at the role of nature in economic growth in Africa and protecting that at the outset.
Thank you very much, Jean-Paul. I'm now going to bring in Richard, because Richard, you've been studying demography for a lifetime. And is Africa unique, or is it similar to other regions? And what can be the impact of this demographic transition on resources? Richard?
Thank you. I'm just going to show one slide really after this introduction slide. Thank you, Franny. While Africa's rapid rate of population growth is not unimportant, it may surprise much of the audience that demographers generally do not believe that it is the sub-Saharan Africa's most immediate demographic problem. Instead, there's a great deal of evidence suggesting that this distinction belongs to the persistence of youthful age structures, what some have called a youth bulge. Can I have the next slide, Sally, please? In this graph, the proportion of young people below age 30 is represented in the vertical axis to the left. The proportion of seniors is displayed on the horizontal axis at the bottom. The points on the graph represent the positions of in 2020 of age structures of the world's nearly 200 countries. At the top left-hand corner are youthful age structures. They look like steep pyramids. They're bulging at the bottom among cohorts of children, adolescents, and young adults. As family size has declined, age structures of countries have become more mature. Their age structure has changed dramatically, and they've moved down to the right bottom and right, and you can see the geometric changes that have occurred. This path describes what demographers call the age structural transition. Now, countries that remain in the upper left-hand corner of this graph experience the same high fertility, persistent youthfulness, and rapid population growth. These are difficult development constraints. For the past half century, the period for which we have these data, that upper left-hand corner has consistently been the site of the highest concentrations of states in civil conflict, the most unstable democracies, the poorest countries, and the countries with the lowest levels of educational attainment and child survival. It doesn't matter if they were Asians or Latin American countries, even European countries, whatever they were in the upper left-hand corner, this is the problem. The yellow points represent the countries of sub-Saharan Africa. And unfortunately, almost all countries in the tropical mid-section of Africa remain in that upper left-hand corner. Only a few countries, small island states like Mauritius and the Seychelles, Cape Verde, and Southern Africa, South Africa and Botswana have left this youthful corner or are in the process of leaving. So here's the million-dollar question. How have most Asian and Latin American countries escaped youthfulness? How did they ultimately enter the demographic window, a term that demographers use to describe the middle of the age structural transition, where you see South Africa and a little below South Africa, where age structures are more favorable for development? And the answer is quite simple: by attaining a total fertility rate of 2.8 children per woman or below. And we know how this can be accomplished: by mandating girls' education to secondary or vocational levels while expanding women's access to the workplace, by protecting girls from early marriage and forced marriage, and thus reducing the frequency of teen pregnancy, and by promoting easy access for both women and men to modern contraception, reproductive information, and reproductive health care. These aren't new ideas for Africa. In fact, this model has been adopted by governments in North Africa, South Africa, and to a great extent in East Africa. Kenya is currently projected to enter the demographic window by 2040. And beyond that, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Zimbabwe, and Madagascar could enter the window, and perhaps Ghana in West Africa before 2050. It's a long way off. Alarmingly, they're well ahead of countries in the Sahel, coastal West Africa, and Central Africa, where fertility remains about 5 children per woman. In these countries, these regions, political leaders and their international partners have often retreated from the difficult social policies and programmatic challenges that they must eventually face to change the shape of their country's age structure. Ignoring demographic problems only makes them larger and ultimately more difficult to address. So I'll end with this demographer's perspective. And that is, even if there were no climate threats, even if there were no threats of jihadist conflict, the current coupling of persistent youthfulness, sustained high fertility, and rapid population growth in the long term in tropical Africa represents an existential threat to states and a security concern for all neighboring regions. Thank you, Franny.
Thank you very much, Richard, for those remarks and the graphics, which are very compelling. I have some questions here from the participants, and I understand Dr. Kaberuka is still with us, and there is one question directed to him that I will bring very quickly to the floor. It's from Joyce Corland, who says, you say that competition for natural resources such as water, land, and wetlands has always existed. Climate change is a threat multiplier, exacerbating loss of natural resources. Using climate finance to restore such natural resources, such as wetlands, would be a way to deal with this. How do you see that, Dr. Kaberuka? Okay, I think we may have challenges for the camera of Dr. Kaberuka. It's coming on. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Actually, the terminology of the ultimate threat multiplier was a UN terminology. by UN reports about 7 years ago. So that's not from me, it's from the UN. What are the prescriptions? Is around financing adaptation. You recall that at the COP in Copenhagen, there was an agreement that we should try and raise $100 billion to help countries in Africa on adaptation. I was part of the team led then by the then Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Meles Zenawi, and the Prime Minister of Norway to try and raise that money. We didn't go very far. It is time now to go back to figure out how we ensure that you can raise enough funding for adaptation. And I'm talking about adaptation not from a Western lens. As I think Mr. Zeofak was saying, adaptation from a Western lens is one thing. But from the lens of low-income countries, it is something else. It's that we have the potential to grow our economies without adding to carbon emissions. The potential of our energy resources, clean energy resources, is still enormous. There are ways we can increase agricultural yields, we can protect our water resources, our forestry resources by enhanced technologies. But all that will require a set of policies, but also significant quantum of finance. So I'm hoping that at the COP in Glasgow, the issues of adaptation for low-income countries, Africa included, is given greater impetus. We know what to do. That is not the issue. But I think we need to figure out how to raise funding, both from public resources and from market-based solutions to do so. I'm hoping I've answered the question, but colleagues can also adapt.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kaberuka. I have a question for Dr. Albert Zeofak from Michael Lomote. Is GDP as a measure for measuring growth favoring the more advanced economies? And if yes, what alternative economic models exist, if any, or are being considered for a climate-threatened Africa? And how much will climate debt and reparations underpin these alternative models?
Thank you very much for that question. There's been a number of panels, international panels, global panels, including those chaired by Nobel Prize winner Joe Stiglitz, about rethinking the measure of economic performance and making sure GDP, which is basically a sum of output, right? Sum of value added. It's an output-based definition, actually includes issues of inclusiveness, issues of well-being, and I think if we expand that line of thought, we should also be adding, greenness, if we can call it that way, to the measure of economic, performance. So, as is, it's possible to think of GDP as actually not adequate measure of well-being. It's possible to actually, and I can give you a concrete example. There are countries that export minerals in Africa quite a lot. That boosts GDP because they do export these stones. But when fiscal regimes and local beneficiation doesn't happen, populations, including in areas where those mines or those stones are produced or picked, do not benefit from it. So GDP in that sense shows an increase in economic activity, but does not reflect economic well-being. And I think it's a reflection. It's a line of thought that is building up, and the participant is right to point out that we should probably think of alternative ways of measuring economic activity. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much. I have a question for Mr. Richard Chikota from Leticia Appia. With Africa's high population growth rate relative to other countries, it means that Africa needs to create more jobs relative to other continents. How does Africa hope to meet the job needs for ever-increasing youthful population? And maybe you can share examples from other regions that have gone through this demographic transition.
Sure. There's, I think there's a feeling among some Africans that that they're going to be doing something that no one else has done, which is create enough jobs and employ enough people without fertility decline. That hasn't happened anywhere unless you're sitting on a lot of oil, or you're a very small country, or you have other very ready sources of foreign income. So the way that countries have done it, like Bangladesh, Iran, Tunisia, and much of North Africa, now Southern Africa, is actually for fertility decline and for the growth rate to drop from virtually unattainable, unemployable levels of 3 and 2.5 to what the US and China have, which is below 1%. I mean, it's not going to come down right away, but ultimately, like Bangladesh and other countries that have entered the demographic window, you meet the increasing jobs with a lower proportion of workers coming into the workforce.
Thank you very much, Richard. We have run out of time, and so I'd like to thank all the speakers and the audience. But before I do that, I want to mention that there are going to be polls at the end of the session, and participants, please give your feedback on the various polls. But I'd like to just apologize that we weren't able to get to all your questions, but there are many other panels coming for the rest of the day. So please keep your questions and come to those sessions. There is now a short break. You will see the polls coming on as well. And then there'll also be some videos that are being streamed from the sponsors and organizers of these events. But if you need to get a cup of tea or coffee, do come back for the next session because there's a lot of excitement and good speakers coming out, including the AU Commissioner Bankole would be speaking, and the former Prime Minister Haile Mariam of Ethiopia would be leading a high-powered discussion on peace, security, and political impact. So don't go away, come back if you do, and thank you so much for your attention and your great questions to the session today. And look out for the polls. Thank you very much.
Honored to be this year's lecturer of the Royal African Society.
Climate change is real and action is desperately needed. Our new research is a rare window in understanding how exactly climate change affects conflict, at the case of Nigeria. Taking a step back, looking across the Sahel, we see that climate change has affected a broader region quite substantially, with increasing temperatures by about 1 degree Celsius and changing rainfall patterns. And this impact of climate change has affected livelihoods and has played a substantial role in violence, more specifically in farmer-herder violence that is observable across the Sahel. There are several reasons to focus this visual on Nigeria. First of all, Nigeria has been affected by climatic distress to a large extent. Secondly, farmer-herder violence is a common problem, especially in Nigeria's Middle Belt region has witnessed a high degree of resource competition and related violence. Climate change affected migratory patterns of pastoralists, which increases the likelihood of both farmers and herders to interact, which in turn increases the likelihood of disputes between the two groups, prompting the government to implement the National Livestock Transformation Plan, a plan that aims at modernizing the livestock sector by installing grazing reserves for pastoralist communities.
We think this plan represents Nigeria's most comprehensive strategy yet to encourage pastoralists to switch to ranching and other sedentary livestock production systems. But inadequate political leadership, funding constraints and uncertainties, and a lack of expertise could derail its implementation. If the plan fails or if it's abandoned by the successive government, Nigeria could suffer more deadly violence, which would further threaten the country's political stability and her food security.
The impact of climate change on local communities can be profound, non-linear, and indirect, and using data can help you to study the issue more systematically. While the Nigeria visuals primarily focus on violence in recent years, we can use the same data and methods to make statements about the future, which potentially could contribute to an early warning methodology. These visuals are important to understand how climate change affects livelihood and conflict. And while the National Livestock Transformation Plan is an important policy acknowledging climate change, it falls short in understanding the mechanisms of climate security. And products like our visuals can help to spotlight on how climate change affects livelihoods and under which circumstances this leads to conflict.